Hello everybody and welcome to Chess Diagnostic. This is Andrew reporting in from Phu Quoc, Vietnam, an island in the south of Vietnam, close to Saigon. Now I'm going to start analyzing the Larsen vs. Fischer 1971 candidates match, and we're going to start with game one, of course. As we know, Fischer swept both of the fields against Taimanov and Larsen 6-0. The difference between this Larsen and Fischer match is that Larsen actually played very well and dynamically, just Fischer outplayed him in every phase of the game. This game starts with e4, Fischer's white, e6, d4, d5, and after knight to c3 and bishop to b4, we get the French winnower variation. A favorite of Bobby Fischer's, and he really was a total master of this opening. He won a lot of games in either attacks or in the endgame as white. So we see the e5 advanced variation, knight to e7, a3, forcing that bishop to take, and now white has doubled c-pawns. But actually, this dark square bishop is compensation because he'll play a4, and he'll really rule the f8 to a3 diagonal. c5, a4, just the standard plan, knight to c6, knight to f3, bishop to d7, bishop to d3, developing, queen to c7, and castles. Now, black doesn't want to castle right away because the bishop takes h7 is a huge threat for white in the winnower, so just be aware of that. There's a lot of complicated things you have to know to play the winnower as white and black, and actually that's why I steer clear from it. But there's a lot of tactical and strategical content depending on if black plays in the center, if he castles queenside, just a lot of options. So let's see what happens here. We see c4 chasing that bishop back, and black could have actually castled, although it's dangerous, but he really wants to play dynamically, Larsen does. So he plays f6. Immediately attacking that e5 pawn, and then we see rook to e1. Fischer's preparing for the e-file to open, as well as pressure on this weak e6 pawn. Knight to g6, and then actually after bishop to a3, preventing black from castling, although he could artificially castle with king to f7, rook to e1, and king to g8. It's still quite dangerous. So Larsen just maintains the tension, but actually accepts the pawn sacrifice of Fischer. Now he takes with the knight, knight takes, and then queen to d4. So Larsen won a pawn, but he gave Fischer the initiative, which is probably a very bad decision practically. And actually after knight to g6, bishop to h5, the best move for black probably would have been to castle, queenside, objectively. After queen takes a7 and b6, we see a queen trade. And actually, after the queens are off, black has a somewhat difficult but very defendable ending, and these weak white pawns, as well as black's somewhat passivity, but he really has defendable structure, and he probably should have done that, but instead we see Larsen make a very dangerous decision, going back here. After bishop to h5, pinning the knight, we see king to f7, trying to artificially castle, but really stepping into the lion's den, because Fischer will play f4, and now he's going to rip open both the center and the king side. Rook to e8, and then f5, immediately striking at that knight and undermining the d5 pawn. Now, Fischer's actually totally winning at this point, under 20 moves. He could have had a miniature in the first game. After queen takes d5 check, the king steps further into the attack with king to f6. Now, what do you think the correct move here was? Think about activity and moving all your pieces as forward as possible. The very simple move, bishop to d6, wins immediately. Now, the queen has to move. The queen actually has to go all the way back, but if he tries to contest that queen on d5, we'll actually see queen to d4, check, and then bishop to f3, bringing the bishop in with a very dangerous tempo. The queen has to go back, and then actually after bishop to d5, the game is already over, because he's going to have to step in either with his rook or bishop, and the e-file pressure will decide, as well as the pin. So instead we saw a blunder, a semi-blunder by Fischer with bishop to f3. He had the right idea, but it's just one tempo too short, and Larsen finds the correct move, knight to e5, cutting off the connection of white's pieces. And notice that if the bishop was on d6, he couldn't play knight to f5, which is the reason that bishop to d6 is very powerful, because actually after bishop to d6, queen to d8, and then bishop to f3. Queen to d4 is threatened, as well as bishop to d5 after, and notice that the knight can't come into e5 to cut off the e file. So actually after bishop to f3, knight to e5, queen to d4 pinning the knight, and then the king steps out of the way. Larsen sacks 2 pieces for a rook, but it's the good practical decision because he's going to get a ton of activity, and I'm always talking about activity, and this is where you can learn about it in this game. Rook takes, queen takes, and now notice that even though he's won 2 bishops for a rook, black is totally active, and he's very ready to attack white's king. Queen to e3 check, and now the king can't go to safety because we'd see actually a 2-move checkmate. Queen to e1, and then rook takes, and the game's over for white. So actually after queen to e3, we see king to f1, and then rook to d2, threatening checkmate in 1. So of course Fischer calculated all this out. Queen to c6, but very complicated tactics. Bishop to c5, contesting that f2 square and protecting it. And now actually after a discovered check, king back, rook takes, Fischer has won a rook and 2 bishops and some pawns against a queen. But it's actually technically equal at this point, and I'll show you a defense that Larsen could have made later on. So practically it's actually a lot harder for black to play here, because white will get a passed a-pawn, and the rook and coordination of the bishops is a lot of times a deciding factor. But let's see what Larsen did. So queen takes c3, correct decision, rook check. Now notice these bishops are covering all the important squares, preventing the queen from checking the king. Bishop takes, and then actually after bishop to b6, Fischer's ready to usher his passed a-pawn in. Queen to b2, bishop to d8 check, getting a tempo on the king and preparing to advance the pawn to a6. Alright, so queen to a3 was the mistake here. This is kind of a computer draw, so I'm not saying Larsen would have found this, but he actually could have got a draw with queen to f2. So queen to f2 prevents the advance of the a6 pawn to a7, and actually has a very sinister threat of f4 and f3. Let's see what happens here. So bishop takes g5, c, and he also has that c passed c pawn. Rook to a1, preparing to advance the pawn, and then f4. And actually, the bishop has to give itself up for that pawn because f3 is a very dangerous threat. And then we see a draw after that c pawn is advanced. Rook takes, and then he probably could have held a draw even though Fischer has an extra bishop. It's not winning. So that was his last chance, and actually after queen to a3 from this position, we see bishop to b7, queen to c5, trying to prevent that pawn advance, and then actually after rook to b1 and bishop to b6, Larsen resigned because he's going to play a7 and queen the pawn next move, and the game is over. A very amazing game by Fischer. Very few inaccuracies by Larsen as well, and he had chances to draw the game, but unfortunately he was just outplayed. So I hope you enjoyed this game, and I'll be moving on to game 3 in the future. Thanks for watching.